So this is our first session on biomechanics, and we'll focus on the ankle and the knee. Essentially, we're going to do the biomechanics starting distally and then work our way up proximally. So the first thing we'll kind of review is just what how the ground reaction force lines up with the stance periods of gait. And so we can see initial contact, loading response, which may be separated by foot flat, mid stance, heel off here, or feet adjacent, we'll talk about that in a minute, terminal stance, and then the transition to opposite foot contact, which starts to mark pre-swing and then toe off. We can see here that the transition from loading response to mid-stance is associated with the peak, where the body's accelerating into the force plate, and so the ground reaction force is higher than the body weight. And then at the transition from mid-stance to terminal stance, the trunk is accelerating away from the force plate. So at F2, there's a minima where the person is lighter than body weight. And then the transition from terminal stance to pre-swing, the foot's pushing into the ground to transfer weight to the opposite leg. So then we have, again, the accelerations of the body are higher than body weight. And that gives us our three peaks. And so this graph can be helpful for just understanding how the moments get generated at each joint, where we can see the force vectors in the vertical and horizontal directions corresponding to F1, F2, and F3 of the ground reaction force is plotted here at different points of stance against the geometry of the limb or the joint angles. And so we can see hip, knee, and ankle here in each one, and so then we can see that, for example, at initial contact, there's 30 degrees of flexion, the knees relatively straight, and the ankles and neutral. And so you can kind of see here how at foot flat, the joint centers here, the ground reaction force is passing posterior to the knee joint center, and it's quite large, so there you would have an external flexion moment at foot flat that then is opposed by an internal extension moment. So you can kind of use this graphic to kind of think through some of the joint moments as we look at the graphs. So I would recommend that you refer back to this as often as you need to. Okay, so let's start by focusing on the ankle. And the first thing we'll do is define another set of kind of phasing or way to look at the ankle based on the kinematics. And essentially what this kind of breaks down is it describes ankle motion in terms of three rockers. And this is popular clinically. And you might see why as we go through the class or the study of gait. And essentially the first rocker is displayed here in these two pictures where the knee is straight, initial contact. So initial contact to foot flat. So this is essentially the same as loading response. And what's happening is the heels or the ankles rocking forward to the ground, and the tibia is kind of going with the foot. And so that's why there's not much motion. There's just a little bit of plantar flexion as the foot goes to the ground. And then there's also just a tiny bit of, the initiation of dorsiflexion before the rocker is over. Okay, and so that's the heel rocker, and that's controlled by the anterior tib. And then essentially the second phase is the ankle rocker, which really is mid-stance. And that's the progression of the tibia over the fixed foot, and that's called the ankle rocker. And essentially that rocker ends at heel off. And then the forefoot rocker is really the mid-stance and pre-swing. Which is the forefoot, the heel and tibia rocking forward on the forefoot point. And so that's why it's called the forefoot rocker. So across stance, people will describe kinematically the association of the tibia and the foot or the ankle motion as three rockers. Heel rocker, and that associates with loading response. The ankle rocker, which is the fixed foot and the tibia moving over the fixed foot. And then finally, the forefoot rocker, which is after the heel comes up, the rocking forward of of the foot and the tibia on the forefoot. So now we're going to discuss the ankle angles, the moments, and the EMG, where we'll take the angles are the motion that's occurring, the moments are the agonist muscles that are controlling that motion, and then the EMG is the co-contraction. And so we can kind of notice here, this first dip in the angles, we have some plantar flexion from initial contact to 10%, and this represents loading response. And so this is our heel rocker, so put HR there, and then shortly after the heel rocker we have dorsiflexion until the heel comes up. So the heel's going to come up somewhere in this zone, and so around 30%, so that's essentially mid-stance. And so this is associated with dorsiflexion, and this is the ankle rocker. And that's when the tibia is rocking forward on the fixed foot. So once the heel comes up, now we're into the forefoot rocker. And now the heel's going to come up, and then the foot's going to move into plantar flexion during pre-swing. So opposite foot contact's about 50%. So the forefoot rocker is occurring into terminal stance through pre-swing. And so this is after the heel comes up, we kind of see this kind of plateau in dorsiflexion, and then just as we're transitioning onto the opposite limb, on this ipsilateral side, we'll see this kind of rapid plantar flexion. Okay, so now we're kind of understanding the motion across a stance phase. Then to finish it off, basically, once it's plantar flexed during initial swing, so it's up to 73% of stance, this initial swing, it's important to get the foot dorsiflexed rapidly, because we know that as we kind of, if you look up here at the picture, the limb's going to have to be progressed for the subsequent heel strike. We have to clear the limb, so to give it enough clearance, we need to dorsiflex the foot as much as possible, so that as we hit that mid-swing phase, the foot is fairly dorsiflexed, so that we can clear the foot and not trip. So then we get back to neutral essentially by the time that the tibia is vertical. So right at that point where we're transitioning from mid-swing to terminal swing. And so that's going to be right here in about 82%. Okay, and so that's kind of our end of swing phase, and then essentially we're set up for the subsequent heel strike kinematically. So now we can kind of break down the moments that are happening at the different rockers. So we can start with the heel rocker. So we know that that's kind of here from 0 to 10%. And so from 0 to 10%, we can see that dorsiflexion is positive again in terms of the moments, and plantar flexion is negative. We have an internal, so these are all internal torques or moments. So I have an internal dorsiflexion moment, and so this would suggest the anterior tibialis or dorsiflexors are on. And we can kind of see here from 0 to 10%, we have a pretty high EMG signal that matches this moment with really low kind of plantar flexors. So we basically have, an unopposed or agonist contraction of the anterior tib with no co-contraction really. So we can kind of see this rapid rise in the plantar flexion moment as the tibia moves here into dorsiflexion. So what's happening though is that the foot's fixed to the ground. So this progression of the tibia is being controlled by the plantar flexors. So this is like an eccentric or isometric contraction. And so we can kind of look down here at the EMG, and so even though this suggests it's controlled by the plantar flexors, what we notice is that there's a period of co-contraction, at least for a bit here, because the anterior tib's continuing to contract, but the agonist here is the plantar flexors. Okay, so as we transition from the ankle rocker to the forefoot rocker, we can see that as the heel comes up here off the ground, there's just a little bit more dorsiflexion, and essentially the plantar flexion moment's increasing until we hit a peak plantar flexion moment at the same point that we start to get some kind of rapid increase in plantar flexion angle. And so what's essentially going to happen here is it's unopposed, so now we have like another agonist contraction of the plantar flexors here that are really helping leverage or move the foot into plantar flexion. And when we look at the powers, we'll get some insight onto how this rapid increase in plantar flexion angle is connected to this high plantar flexion torque. So here, let's take a look at the powers now. So we've kind of been through this before, so we see the angles here, and then here's the moments, and then essentially to understand what's happening in terms of concentric and eccentric energy generation at the ankle, we can look at the powers. And just recall that the joint powers are the moment times the angular velocity. So this large peak here is essentially this graph times whatever angular velocity is occurring at each point in time. And then the area under this curve is the amount of energy in joules that's being generated by that muscle contraction. So you can see the units here for instantaneous curve are watts per kilogram, and then the area gives us joules. And then here we review this again. So essentially we've identified these different bursts. So this would be at the A1 burst, the A2 burst, and then the A3 burst, where the A1 burst is the eccentric control of the ankle dorsiflexors, the A2 burst is the eccentric control of the plantar flexors, and then the A3, which this should be A3, not A2, is the concentric plantar flexion contraction just before opposite initial contact. So in this graphic here, we can kind of see a picture of the ground reaction force and a close-up of the geometry of the limb. So we have the ankle rocker represented here with the ground reaction force acting on the heel, so it's tending to externally plantar flex the foot, and then the ankle plantar flexors or ankle dorsiflexors control that. And then essentially after loading response, the foot's flat, and then we have this co-contraction between the anterior tib and other dorsiflexors and the plantar flexors, which kind of control the progression of the limb at mid-stance. Okay, so here we're going to try to integrate all this information. So here we'll integrate all of this based on the rocker. So what this is telling us is during the heel rocker, the ground reaction force is posterior to the ankle joint center, which is here. So the external moment is toward plantar flexion. And so then we can see here that the ankle dorsiflexors are acting to oppose that internally and control the descent of the foot to the ground and the progression of the tibia. And then as we transition here into mid-stance, we can see that the tibia is now progressing over a fixed foot. And so this kind of slow dorsiflexion that's happening is controlled with an eccentric or isometric contraction of the plantar flexors. And so it's typically described as eccentric, but we can see by the powers that the power generated is very low. And then essentially that transitions near heel off to terminal stance. And at terminal stance, we're into the forefoot rocker. And with that, then we can see that eventually that the plantar flexors generate a large amount of power, which helps shift the weight to the opposite limb and prepare the ipsilateral side for toe off for swing. So then we can apply this. So there's an example of pathologic gait. So here's our normal gait pattern here, and we'll just apply it to kinematics in the moments in this kind of early phase of the gait cycle, because we can kind of see here they're in double support. The left limb has just experienced initial contact, and so at this point what we'd expect to see is a neutral foot and the heel only in contact, and instead what we're seeing is the tibia is back, so our posterior. And so if we look at the foot here, that's a plantar flexed foot position. So at initial contact, so that's our phase. So we're just starting the loading response phase, and that the tibia, that plantar flexion at the ankles, like holding the tibia posteriorly, and so it's limiting that forward progression. So that's an example of how we can use normal patterns to kind of understand what might not be working when we watch somebody walk with different kinds of pathology. Okay, here's another point of the gait cycle. And so essentially what we can start to identify is first is where in the gait cycle is this person in. And so we have to kind of use the opposite limb as well as kind of what we understand about gait. And so we can kind of see the heels just coming up here on the ipsilateral side or the left side, and that the opposite limb has already swung in front of the ankle. So this is almost at the transition on the opposite side from mid-swing to terminal swing. So this is terminal stance phase, or just the past when you'd expect terminal stance to begin on the ipsilateral side. So we should be looking for a normal pattern. We should be looking in this range. So we expect about 10 degrees of dorsiflexion. Essentially the tibia is still even back a little bit or slightly close to neutral. So it's still we're not really achieving much forward progression. So in this particular case, we're thinking, reduced ankle dorsiflexion during terminal stance. And so what we can kind of, we can also say that the ankle rocker is absent. So then here's some typical things to look for that we'll cover during pathologic gait. Is the first thing is what we saw in the example video of a pathologic case, plantar flexion at initial contact instead of foot at neutral. We saw restrained tibial advancement or tibial progression during the ankle rocker. You could also have excessive tibial advancement. You can have decreased plantar flexion at push-off. So this phase of the gait cycle here could be decreased. We've kind of seen that in some graphs earlier, so you could have it look kind of like this. And so in that particular case, they would have also a decreased ankle joint power. Concentric power at the A3 or the third burst. And then finally we can see this kinematic here where you have to go from plantar flexion to dorsiflexion to clear the limb. And if you don't have that dorsiflexion to clear the limb, it could be associated with tripping. We're going to key in on two different periods of the gait cycle and relate this to trunk velocity. So we want to talk about how the ankle contributes to trunk velocity at two different points. So the first is considered a key point of gait. Essentially, this occurs after foot flat. The tibia must be stable for the femur to rotate forward, and i.e. knee extension and hip extension. So this first point of stance focuses on that. And so essentially this is the 15% of the gait cycle. So that's just after loading response is over. So this is definitely in the mid-stance phase. And then this graphic right here is the transition from mid-stance to terminal stance. And so here we have, and so terminal stance is over here. And then, essentially we have about halfway through terminal stance. So let's focus on this part right here. So essentially what we can see is the foot's off the floor, the hip is still extended, and the knee is still flexed. So this is this trunk velocity. We need an element of this that's anterior, and there's an element that's forward. And so the femur is going to rotate to a vertical position by 30% of stance, so that essentially we have this, maintain this trunk velocity while the tibia is relatively stable. So look how much the femur is moving with very little movement of the tibia. So the stability that's provided by the gastrocsoleus muscles at this point of stance is critical for the femur to be able to rotate forward to get past this mid-stance transition to terminal stance. And so that motion of the femur is essentially what moves the trunk forward and slightly upward. And it's that upward acceleration that causes the F2 ground reaction force to be lower than body weight. Okay, so the second key has to do with 45% of stance, or as we kind of get into this zone over here. And so what we could see is that at push-off, the knee must be straight for the ankle plantar flexion to push the pelvis up and forward. So what we can see here is the contribution of the gastroc and soleus to the trunk velocity, and that's these arrows here. So notice that as we go from 30% to 45%, that the gastroc and soleus arrows are making major contributions to the trunk in terms of an upward and forward direction. And here, as we get to 45%, we notice that the gastroc vector has translated, so it's a little bit anterior, the soleus is still anterior, so they're supporting the trunk and then also giving it some anterior velocity. And look at the soleus vector. Look at the anterior force on the trunk. So that's pretty significant, right? So we want to understand how the plantar flexors can be so important to the velocity of the trunk, and these arrows kind of help us out. So we can see here, first of all, is that as we kind of enter the terminal stance phase, the ankle still isn't very plantar flexed, and it starts to kind of really tip the scales into plantar flexion somewhere around 45% of stance. So the heel's clearly off the ground, okay, and we're starting to get into some rapid plantar flexion just at this point. But notice when the ankle's plantar flexing that the knee is relatively extended and that the trunk is firmly in front of the foot. And so at this point, so if we lengthen the leg by plantar flexing the ankle, the forces that are generated, the ground reaction forces that are generated through the plantar flexion torque, is then transferred up through the femur and to the trunk to kind of anteriorly and vertically translate the trunk. And so the plantar flexors are effective in terms of moving the trunk only if the trunk is anterior to the foot and that the knee is relatively extended. And so the more extended the knee is, then the more effective the plantar flexors can be in transferring that energy to the trunk with very little contribution of energy at the knee joint. Okay, so just in review, the ankle plantar flexors are important for setting up forward progression at two key points of stance. The first one is in mid-stance, where the tibia stabilizes. The first one is in mid-stance, where the stability of the tibia is important to allow the femur to go from a posteriorly rotated to an anteriorly rotated position. So that's knee extension and hip extension. And then in terminal stance, with the trunk being anterior to the foot and the knee relatively extended, we get that plantar flexion to occur. That plantar flexion torque basically is transferred up to the trunk to move the trunk forward and up. Here's some important review points. One, To clear the limb, you need dorsiflexion during swing. Limb clearance is very small, about 1.5 centimeters. The importance of the plantar flexors during mid-stance to stabilize the tibia so the femur can rotate. 3, plantar flexion in terminal stance is important in terms of forward progression and has to occur, the timing of that has to occur after the trunk is anterior to the stance foot. Okay, that's all for now.